Escape from Giant's Crown. Chapter 7. Byron's Secret. Standing alone in the dark hallway deep beneath his mansion, Mayor Byron shot glances over both shoulders before removing the candle from its encasement on the wall, activating a secret entrance. The rotating wall was perfectly concealed and had been there since long before his time. This place was so secret, even his loyal servant Dindal did not know of its existence. Rotating the large section of the wall sealed him within the darkened chamber. Green candles illuminated the rounded corners of the walls. He stumbled through the corridor and held the candle out in front of him, squinting as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. In his other hand, he held a small cage covered in cloth. Its occupant chirped until he banged the cage with the candlestick. As he stepped into the blackness, he nearly slipped on one of the many gold pins that lay in piles at his feet. Spiderwebs spun out from every corner of the dusty room, and he spent some time untangling himself from their sticky threads before continuing. In the center of the room, a dim white pillar of light shot down onto the circular pattern on the floor. Dust floated up as if completely unaffected by gravity. A light breeze wafted through, stirring the plumes of dust, and thousands of small black spidery shadows began to swarm into a slender, ominous form along the wall behind him. The green candles seemed brighter now, underlighting the large, shadowy, spindling tendrils that enveloped the shaft of light. Byron stumbled backward until his backside nudged into something. Spinning around abruptly, he nearly toppled over, just before his own candlelight flickered out. He looked down at it and pouted. "Oh, pooh," he muttered before turning his attention to the familiar dark figure. He fell to his knees and averted his eyes from the tall, slender form of what stood before him. There stood the figure of a woman particularly obscured in darkness. She was adorned in long, flowing, aged robes, with patterns from the western lands imprinted across the winged collar. The streams of decorative cloth extended all the way to the ground. Her attire seemed to have a life of its own, and it flowed around her as if she were underwater. Attached to the knotted ends of her robe and around her neck, she wore cylinders and bone trinkets with many symbols and glowing gems affixed to them. Not many had seen such symbols, but Byron had traveled enough to know that they were not made by anyone in the eastern continent. Much of her body was concealed in shadow, but from the brief glimpses of her long curves, he knew that she was a woman underneath the mystique. He was sure of it. After all, he was one of the few men in Giant's Crown who'd ever even actually seen a real female. Despite her crinkled hair and masked visage, he could not help but be seduced by her power. It was as if he were wrapped in an illusion that left him paralyzed and unable to resist her bidding. She was known in the old books and Spearian histories as the Faceless One, but Byron had come to know her as Orchid. He had read about her in legends, but hadn't believed the fairy tales until he'd arrived in Giant's Crown. Why she had earned such a moniker was no mystery. According to the stories, she wore the faces of her human victims and used them to take physical form, stalling the relentless turning of the clock. The truth of this could not be accounted for, however, since she wore a stone plate mask which concealed her face entirely, aside from several eye slits down the front of it. But the horns on either side of her head were not like any animal in Speria, and they rested just above her pointed green-hued ears and made him suspect she was not human at all. The mysterious legends and her power over the living intoxicated Byron. She chilled him to the core, like a spider-struck insect sapped of its strength. But each time he left her chamber, he fantasized about being close to her again. To all that had heard her tale, she was a monster, but to Byron she was much more than that. He would murder every living thing in the eastern continent if she would give him a taste of her immortal power. The black shadows shifted, hardening. Reaching for him, he froze. Pointed tendrils probed his clothes, his pockets, the cage, black, woody fingers sensing the contents of his gift with eager anticipation. The creaking twigs sprouted, jutting out as if entire seasons passed in seconds, nodding and coiling as they bent around him until they engulfed the cage in his hand.
"What have you brought me today, my young lover?"
Came a slithering echo of a voice. It reverberated within the walls of his anxious mind. Having long passed his 50th birthday, he chuckled each time she called him that. "Oh, a foreign delicacy for you, my goddess." He hoped his paltry gift would suffice. Galafi, bird from the forests of Liongate. He swallowed hard, maintaining his composure in the face of the intimidating creature standing before him. He snatched the cloth off of the cage. "I just came in from the shipyard this morning." The small bird hopped along the perch, completely oblivious to its impending fate. Orchid's tendrils probed the cage, coiling seductively around its knobs and twisting through the gaps in its delicate filigree railings. The Galifi flapped its wings and chirped in alarm, but it was too late. Orchid clicked and moaned with anticipation. and her wooden appendages slithered out from her legs and slipped between the small creature's feathers like pointed fingers. They struck its frail neck and then glowed with purple light. The glow pulsed down through each coiling branch toward her swaying form, which looked far more feminine with her robes tightening across her body. With each progressive blast of life essence that pumped from the Galifi, she whimpered, twisting her long fingers, almost as if she were conducting an orchestra. The bird's feathers turned a dull gray, wilted and fell to the floor of the cage. Its face shriveled to the bone. Orchid fell to her knees, shivering and panting under her long, ratty locks of white hair.
Still too weak.
She groaned, hungry for more. Byron's heart beat faster as he wondered, not for the first time, if he were next on the menu.
Is this the extent of your love for me, dear Byron?
A woody tendril reached up and caressed his neck. The slits in her mask glowed with that same purple light as she examined the smoothness of her skin on the back of her own hands. Every blemish and wrinkle disappeared briefly, but soon returned. Byron watched eagerly, fascinated by her display of power. Whatever ability it was that allowed her to absorb this life essence from his gifts, he wanted it. It allowed her to live forever, and the idea of cheating death itself intoxicated him. His calculating mind had never been at such a disadvantage, and had both infuriated and compelled him. If only he could find what she truly wanted, then it would be she who would bow to his will. Only then could he seize his reward, his eternal reward, the secret of her immortality. But first, he had to offer her the perfect gift. Something different, something new. There's he stuttered.
A what?
She demanded, her tendrils wrapping around his chest and hoisting him into the air. A boy. Byron gasped to get the words out, feigning confidence in his discovery. He'd hoped that it would be enough to entice her. For years, Orchid had siphoned life essence from her victims to maintain her youth. Over the many years, he'd brought her many living things from all over the world, including those unfortunate souls who'd won his little peach pin lottery. But not one of his gifts had satisfied her.
Not enough,
she would always say. The words began to drive him mad. All the poor wretches in Giant's Crown would not be enough to satisfy her thirst. But there had never been a child in the city, let alone a Moonken child. After all, Moonken were known to live for far more than 200 years. The amount of life essence she could extract from him would have to be several times more than any mere human victim could offer. Orchid curiously tilted her neck and released her tendrils enough for him to breathe. Yes, that's right. The new guy has a kid. Strangest thing, the child's got white hair and pointy ears. Moonken, Wheezy called him. Orchid jerked him closer. The glow in her eyes grew bright and wide through the slits in her cold stone mask.
White hair? And pointy ears, you say?
Her gaze darted from side to side in disbelief at what such a discovery could mean. Moonken were known to live for hundreds of years. If she were to feed on one, perhaps she could retain her youthful visage indefinitely.
And he's only a boy? Is it possible a Moonken child would turn back the clock many times over?
She crooned suddenly, shifting her tone to an alluring melody.
You know what I want for my sweet 1016th birthday? Would my love kindly bring the boy to me?
She caressed his cheek with the back of her hand.
Would you do that for me, my pet?
Still held in her tendrils and quite frightened, Byron swallowed hard. He rested his feet on the floor once more and let out a sigh of relief, then assured her. Oh, why, of course, my dove. I had intended to tell you all along, but I was saving him as a surprise. Obviously, I know how much you enjoy surprise gifts.
Then, my love.
She wrapped her arms around him, her fingers gripping her mask, and she forcefully turned his head to face her. The purple glow seemed to illuminate the entire room, causing him to blink. When he opened his eyes, the entire room began to transform in that purple light. The bleak walls turned to a gold and porcelain and bright, shining gold statues of him proudly lining the lavish hall. He knew that it was merely a vision. It was all part of her strange magic, but it didn't matter. He was lost in the fantasy and promise of opulence. He was lost in the idea of life among the peaches, with him at the center of it all. It was the promise of a dream beyond what any man could ever want. She spun out in front of him in a twirling dance. To his surprise, she appeared not as the monster he'd imagined she would be behind the mask, but as an elegant woman dressed in a long flowing gown. She was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Her eyes were still glowing a bright purple, but now her alabaster skin emanated the same glow. Her hair was no longer mangled, but rippled down her waist in the bright warm sunlight. Her lips were moist and pouted as she danced so close to his face that he felt her warm breath. When he gazed off into the vision, beyond the glorious flowing curtains of the great hall, the peaks of the entire city of Giant's Crown poked through the mist below them, bathed in purple glowing light. The people of Giant's Crown chanted his name, and his heart beat heavily in his chest.
Bring me the boy.
She whispered.
Then we will finally be together. Forever.